this third video on Reactor 6 and blocks, we're going to take a look at some different modulation options. To start with, we'll look at a fairly simple ensemble combining an LFO and an envelope using the mod A and B inlet, and then look at using the CV mixer to combine some different modulation sources. So I've already set up a very basic patch here. We've got an oscillator going through a VCA, and that VCA in turn is being modulated by this ADSR. Now what I want to do is I want to get the pitch to increase slowly whilst also being modulated by an LFO. So let's just drag in an ADSR. That's going to be triggered by the gate, and the out of that is going to go into mod A of my oscillator. And then what I also want is an LFO, so let's drag in an LFO, and the output of this is just going to go into mod B. So now if I press a note, it sounds exactly the same because we need to specify the modulation sources. What I also should do as well is just label up this ADSR. So let's call it pitch ADSR, and now what I'm going to do is just going to turn keyboard tracking off on this oscillator, and I'm going to dial around that frequency, click on modulation A, and then increase the modulation amount. So you can now see that this parameter is being modulated. Let's slow this up a bit so the attack Okay, so we've slowed the attack up there. You'll also notice, because it's a linear shape, it goes quite quickly through those bass frequencies. So that might be what you want, but if you click on this line, it will change the shape. So this is now an exponential curve. Just goes through those low frequencies, a bit slower, and then gets progressively faster. Now what we want to do is add a little bit of wobble to this from the LFO. Let's go for a faster rate here. And at the moment the LFO is coming on mod B, and you can see that flashing away. So that wobbles all the way up, and actually I don't want it to start off wobbling at the low frequency. So what we need to do is we need an envelope to control the onset of the LFO. So let's move this back across here. So what I'm going to use is Pro CV Processor, and then go from the out of the LFO into the processor and then onto the mod B input. I can actually just use this same envelope because it's just starting low and going high. So I'm going to go from the out of that into the mod A inlet, and let's just drag and drop that around there. So what we need to do here is select modulation A, which is where the output of our pitch ADSR is going, and I just need to increase the modulation amount here. What will also be quite interesting is if we to get the frequency of the LFO also to change as well. So let's come from the out of our pitch ADSR into mod A inlet here and enable that, and then push up the modulation amount. Now typically when you do this you might find you need to adjust the actual original frequency. Now going all the way to the top, I'm just going to pull down the modulation amount on the frequency here. So we still get that kind of warbling effect right at the top. Let's also make it a bit more intense. Put it something like a pulse wave. And then the pitch starts to wobble in a more intense way as it rises up. So in this next example, we're going to load Reaktor as an AU instrument within Logic. And I've already set up part of a patch here. So I've got an oscillator going through a VCA. That VCA is being triggered by this amp ADSR, and that in turn is being triggered every 16th note by the gate signal. What I'm going to do is try and get over the limitation of the fact that we've only got two modulation inputs on each block, mod A and mod B. So let's come to library. So I want to mix my modulation sources together, and you'll find in utility a mix CV mix. Now, just for ease of listening, setting this up, I'm just going to route it directly into the pitch inlet, but obviously we could put that into mod A or mod B. And let's now create some different modulation sources. So drop in an LFO and an envelope. And in fact, I'm just going to use the gate source as well. And the LFO will go into input 2. To trigger the envelope, I'm just going to trigger it every bar. So I'm going to make use of the reset output. And then that can go into in3. And if we wanted to, we could also, let's say, route in mod wheel into inlet 4. So it gives us a number of different options. If you want more modulation sources to control one parameter, you can always daisy chain your mixers together. That'll do for now. Let's come back to the panel. So the CV mix has got a whole range of faders labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and you've also got a master fader. So we're going to turn up the master fader, and let's press play. So this is coming from our gate source, which is basically a square wave. So we can modulate the pitch in a positive way or subtract from the current pitch. You can also set the range as well. So if I click on range, you then got a minimum and maximum value. And you can also move both minimum and maximum just by clicking in the middle. So that gives you lots of options for controlling the modulation amount. So that is our gate signal. This is our LFO, which is slowly oscillating up and down. And then we've also got our envelope on inlet 3. And at the moment, this is being triggered by the reset. This isn't turned on, so let's turn it on, and that's set to 16. So when the gate is on 16th notes, essentially what we'll find is it will reset every bar. There we go. Or we can go the other way. So now we've got 3 modulation sources all acting on one parameter. As I said, we could also route our modulation wheel through, and then that can also affect the actual parameter. So let's now just unmute the beat. So as we've got the gate source coming from the utility clock, and because we've switched the clock source to external, that means it's perfectly in sync with the timeline from your DAW. Incidentally, you might have noticed that there's no sync feature in the LFOs. If you want to, you could go to the Reaktor user library where people are uploading a variety of different blocks. So here's the Bento LFO, which has got a sync option, and that allows you to sync your LFOs to the timeline.